back. We're going to lay the front brakes on this 2000 Buick Lesabre today. This is the same car I did front control arms in, and I noticed at the time the brakes need to be replaced, so we're going to do that today. Additionally, today as we do these brakes, I'm going to do a little bit of a tool review on this DeWalt 1/2-inch impact wrench electric. It's a DW292. I haven't used it before. I have air, and I like air tools. I also like the cordless. This is a corded, but for somebody who doesn't have maybe an air compressor and tools, this electric or a cordless, the cordless is going to be a lot more expensive than this. They're nice. Will probably be cheaper for you than trying to buy a air compressor and air tools and everything you need to do that. So we're gonna use this. I haven't used it before. We're just gonna see how it works. It's a little big, it's a little heavy, but if you're not doing a lot of work and you need to remove tires and do things like that, we're gonna see if this works out okay. So I've jacked this car up safely up on jack stands in the front, so I can take the wheels off and get these brakes, and we're going to try this tool, and we're going to see how it does. So, not having tried this tool before, just right off the bat, I can't recommend it. And it's not a bad tool. I don't think it's a bad tool, but for automotive work, it obviously it just doesn't have the power that's needed to take even these lug nuts off correctly. So I've switched over to my air impact. This is an Ingersoll Rand 321C or 231C. It's my dyslexia sneaking in there. This is probably one of the most, if not the most used guns. It's pretty inexpensive. I think I spent $105, $110 on this, and it has not let me down. It's taken off everything I've had to take off. The only thing I could think that maybe would have a problem with is Honda crankshaft pulley bolts. A lot of guns have a problem with them, but there are solutions for that out there. So you're going to see the difference here. Between that electric that I just tried to use and this, my guess is this will be much better. So you can see the difference. This takes them right off without any problem. So we've taken the wheel off, and the first thing we have to do is get into that bolt there, and there's one on the lower half of that steering knuckle, and that's going to hold the whole caliper, brake caliper onto the rotor. We're going to undo them. So what you just saw me do with a hammer is basically break those bolts so they're really tight. What I will say is if you have a really good set of wrenches, a pair of Snap-on or anything Matco, even a Craftsman Pro Series, which are pretty nice wrenches. I don't recommend doing that. It's not real nice to beat your wrenches to death with a hammer. Some of these bolts you get in here, you really can't get a gun on them. I couldn't get a breaker bar on them. I just didn't have enough room. So I have a couple of cheap sets of wrenches, which are, really inexpensive, but they'll do the job. And I use them when I do things like this, where I have to beat on it with a hammer. And I want to take my good wrenches, basically, that I have and do that. But these are perfect for that. If I break one, I break one. It's no big deal. They're pretty inexpensive, and just replace it. These pads are getting a little close. They're not too bad, but I mean, you can see the inside one's pretty close to being done. But primarily, the reason these need to be replaced right now, you can see a little bit on this side. I know the other side you can see it clear, and I'll show that to you at the end on the other side. But what's happening with these is what I call rust jacking, where corrosion is corroding the metal backing plate, and it's separating the brake pad from the metal backing plate. And they will fail. I mean, they haven't failed yet, but at some point they're gonna get enough corrosion behind them and enough separation that they'll crack and they'll fail. So these definitely need to be done. And honestly, the inside pad's almost down and gone at this point where it needs to be replaced. So we're gonna replace and fix it. Okay, so let's see if I get my light to stay put. We're gonna take this. These are the slide pins. The caliper slides back and forth, or in and out, I should say, when the brakes are used. We're gonna remove these bolts, and we're gonna take this apart and clean it. Always a good idea to do that when you're replacing brakes, in case there's any corrosion problems inside or grease problems. These have to operate and be able to slide smoothly for the brake to work effectively. Well, try not to drop them like that. It's fine. Don't break anything. Yeah, this is the slide pin I was talking about. Just clean it up real good. I'm going to re-grease that. Make sure it's cleaned out inside. So, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a big proponent of replacing the hardware on every time you do brakes. It needs to be clean, and it needs to allow the pads to slide as they should. Corrosion tends to get behind it and then push up on the pad, the end of the tabs on the pad, and then they won't slide. They kind of lock up and don't work like they should. So always, this hardware I'm going to pull off here in a second, always replace that. I'll go into that a little more as we get into it. So there's the hardware. I just pulled that off, as you could see. You can see where it sits in the caliper, in the bracket for the caliper. So I'm going to clean that really good, get any corrosion out of there on both ends. There's that end and that end, pretty much the same on both sides. And I'm going to grease behind the new hardware to keep the moisture from getting behind it and creating corrosion in there. It'll make the pads last longer, and they'll work better. You'll have better braking. These are actually in pretty good shape. They're not corroded too badly. A lot of times they're worse, but these are actually pretty clean, so we're going to clean them up real good. So I've got some brake grease, high temp grease. It has to be high temp for this, so it doesn't melt out. Some leftover from pads that came in another car. We're going to put some on there. Just cover it real good. Fortunately, I don't have an acid brush right now. I had to get some more, so I get to use my fingers instead. Don't need a ton on here. Just want to get it covered. Make sure it's covered well. So you can see, greased both ends of this bracket for the caliper very well. I'm covered. I'm going to put the new hardware on them now. It just clips in there, and that's what the pad rides on, slides on. Don't want grease on top of it. Just needs to be underneath it to try to keep the corrosion from getting behind it. So now, new hardware on there. Pads will sit in there. I'm going to put a set of pads in here just to show you what they're going to look like and how they slide in. They should go in. You shouldn't have to modify the pads or the backing plates. Good pads, decent, quality pads will fit right in there well. So one thing to note, you see that tab right there, which is an indicator when the pad gets thin enough that will start hitting the rotor and making noise to tell you that you need to change. You can see one pad has it, one pad doesn't. Each car's a little different. I know this was the outside pad and this is the inner pad. So when I put the new pads on there, I want to make sure the pad that has that indicator is on the outside, basically. And here are the new pads for this. These are AC Delcos. We're going to see how they do. Hopefully they'll do well. So you can see this moves relatively easily in there, and that's what we want. We want them to be able to slide back and forth. Just put one end in like that. That's it. So they're in the holder, in the bracket for the caliper, ready to go. Greased, new hardware, good pads. Okay, one other point I wanted to make here. We're going to push this piston back in. I'll show you that in a minute. But these tabs down here that the actual brake pad rides on, you can see they're a little beat up. And just like we cleaned the bracket and before we put the hardware on and greased it, we're going to do the same thing in here. The pad's going to run against here or ride against this. I'll get my light straightened out there. The pad's going to ride against that. And so we don't want rust getting behind it and pushing the pad around and causing a problem. So we're going to clean them off. I get the rust off of them. They're not too bad, but they do need to be cleaned. And we're going to grease them before we put it back together. When I file these, I'm not trying to take any metal off. I'm just removing any corrosion that might be on there. I don't want to actually file these down. Just cleaning the rust off, the surface rust off of them. Really good. Okay, so that's much better. Clean them off with a brake cleaner. This is just disc brake grease. So I'm going to put on each side of this. Cover that so it can't corrode. You can see there that this has been cleaned and greased and it's ready to go. We're going to push the piston back into the caliper next so we can put it all back together. So I have a tool for this. Yeah, there's various tools for this, but you can use a C-clamp. You can put a C-clamp in here. What I'll do is take a pad, find a bigger pad here. I'll take an old pad and I'll put it in the bore like that, into the caliper. Take this tool. You could do the same thing with a C-clamp and grab it around here and squeeze it in. And then I'll turn this in, get it started here. In a better position. Let me move this and get it in a better position where we can actually turn and push this piston back in. Now, some people are real sticklers about this. I've never had a problem. Some people will break that bleeder where it hooks into the caliper loose so it doesn't push back to the master cylinder. I've never had an issue with it causing a problem, ever. These should turn back in relatively easy. They do have a little bit of pressure on them because they're pressurized hydraulic system, but they shouldn't be that hard to push back in. This is going in pretty easily. That's all the way back in. So that piston's been pushed all the way back in. Now I'm going to put a little grease on that edge of that piston as well, just to keep it from corroding anymore. That's pushing against the back of the pad as well, so you don't want corrosion getting in there, causing an issue. So we're just going to hang this piston up off of the coil spring here, strut, just to get it out of the way, so we can finish up what we're doing. So, I have the caliper bracket, new pads are in there. We've greased everything under the hardware. We're going to put the slide pins, we're going to get the slide pins ready to put back in here. I did not replace these boots. There's a metal, you can replace these boots, but I checked them out. They look good, they're not hard, they're not cracked or brittle, so I'm going to leave them alone. They can be replaced if they're torn or cracked. If they're torn or cracked, you need to replace them, but these look pretty good, so I'm going to just leave them alone. Here's the slide pins that we took out that go back in here. We're going to put a little bit of grease on these. You don't need a ton of grease on these. It'll actually cause a problem if you put too much because it's a sealed, once it gets in there it's sealed. But we want them to slide, so we're going to put a little brake grease on these before we stick them back in there. So I have new rotors. I was originally going to get these cut, the ones that were on here, but they were too thin. So couldn't cut them, had to get new ones. We'll put these on there, but we're going to clean them first when they're new. They have a coating on them, keep them from rusting. We'll just use a little brake cleaner to clean these off and make sure they're ready to go. Okay, they're clean and ready to go. Before I do that, I'm actually going to clean this a little bit, this hub, this inside portion of the rotor sits against. A lot of times these get really corroded and they're hard to get off. So we're going to clean this and then put some anti-seize on here just to keep it from corroding and sticking together. It makes it easier for the next person who has to do something in here. It comes apart a lot easier. These aren't corroded very bad at all. They're pretty clean actually, which is nice. So we're going to keep them that way, hopefully, by coating them. With some anti-seize. Brake cleaner. We'll just put some anti-seize on the we're going to put the rotor back on here, put a lug nut on it, hold it in place, make it a little easier for us. And then we'll start to put the caliper back on there. See, I'm just going to hang this on there. Put a lug nut on it like that, hold it in place, makes it easier to do. So now we're ready to hang caliper bracket back on to the steering knuckle. And get the bolts for it and hang it back on there. So, right back in here is where that bracket for the caliper is going to mount. We're going to mount it right in there, slide it around the caliper, get it lined up, and put a bolt in there, top and bottom, to hold in place. Probably a little tough to see, kind of hard to hold the camera. I need a third hand, that's what I need. So I've got both of those bolts down in there started. I'm just going to run them in. I'm not going to really tighten them up all that tight with a gun, but I'll run them in with a gun and then I'll tighten them by hand when we're finishing up. Okay, I just ran them in real quick. Can't see anything, but just ran those two bolts. There's a top one right there. Ran them in real quick, snugged them up. Now we're going to hang the actual caliper on the bracket, and you see these boots right here. Let me see if I can get this a little better. Stay put there. So the boots that are right here, my fingers on them, see it moving around. When you put the caliper back over this, make sure you don't damage these boots. Alright, so there's a good shot. The light on it pretty good of the upper and lower slide pin mount for the actual caliper. So like I said before, you have to be careful with these. When we put this on here, you'll see I'm going to adjust these. I don't want to tear them and line them up so we can put the pins back. So I'm just going to slide this caliper right back on. That probably looked really good. So you can see how it's hitting that boot. So we're going to take that boot, line it back up. Get a slide pin. This has been greased already. Make sure it's lined up correctly. Make sure it's lined up. I line up, slide this pin in. Get it started. It's not in there yet. It's a little tough to do this with just two hands. There it goes. So I've got the top one lined up. Now I'm going to go to the bottom one and do the same thing here. You can see it. The boot is, you can't really see it, but push that boot into place. Make sure it's lined up correctly. Make sure it's lined up right there, that boot. Don't want to tear it. Right there's the lower. That's not going to work too good now, is it? Try it this way so you can see. So I've got the boot lined up. I'm just going to start this, wiggle it in, start it by hand, make sure it starts okay, which it does. Now I'm going to run them in with a gun, but I'm not going to tighten them up real tight. I'm just going to run them in and I'll tighten them by hand. So now the caliper, you see this will slide back and forth like it's supposed to. So that's basically it. I'm going to tighten this up now. The caliper's back on with new pads, new hardware, it's greased, new rotor. Couldn't cut the old ones, so we put new ones on. And it's pretty much ready to go. We're just going to tighten everything up now. Okay, I came back, tightened those 4 bolts up. It's good to go. I'm just going to pull this lug nut that we use to hold the rotor in place, take that off, put the wheel back on, snug it up, torque it down, take this for a test drive. It should be good to go. Okay, so one point here. So when you do these brakes, you do this. When you get in the car and you're done, pump the brakes a few times. They're going to have to seat themselves, or otherwise you won't have any brakes. You'll just have back brakes, and then I'm doing the fronts here. You won't have any fronts. That's not a good thing. So make sure you pump the brake several times until you feel it kind of harden up before you try to drive this anywhere, and allow the pads to kind of reseat themselves to the rotor and get where they need to be. Just a point of safety.